Cherry Milkshakes by Small Bird. Read by Plant83. Here's the summary. Or maybe Izuku just really liked their milkshakes. I mean, come on. Student discounts were definitely worth an occasional brush with death. Alternatively, in which Izuku Midoriya should probably stop hanging out with villains in his free time. But common sense has never been one of his Izuku Midoriya was exceptionally unlucky when it came to shopping mall outings. Or perhaps, and on second thought, much more likely, it was just this particular mall which he should have crossed out from his list of places to visit on a slow day way back at the beginning of their first high school year. But Izuku Midoriya was stubborn, or maybe naive, or perhaps even stupid, depending on whom you ask. And the mall had a lovely milkshake place. It offered student discounts. The dorm buildings at UA were a welcome development. It was easier to train, easier to study for tests or do homework, when your classmates were all just a quarter and a knock away. Yet sometimes, and Midoriya knew for a fact that he wasn't the only one of this opinion, it all got a little too much. Sometimes you just want to not have people looking over your shoulder every waking hour. And the mall was nearby, alright? A few streets away, or one bus stop if you were feeling lazy. It had a lovely milkshake place and an arcade, and enough shops to pass an afternoon distracted from all the work and expectations and dangers of a UA student life. So sometimes Izuku would get his permission from Aizawa-sensei. The man wasn't fussy about it. Then slip out of the school gates with the intention to return in a couple of hours with some new All Might merch or a cool shirt. But here's the catch. You can only be distracted from the dangers of a UA student life if said dangers don't follow in your footsteps. And when it came to dangers, Izuku Midoriya was exceptionally unlucky. Or, again, naive, stubborn, stupid, underline as applicable. The first time it happened was on a Saturday afternoon. Izuku was sitting in the milkshake shop at a wrought iron table decorated by flowers whose petals fluttered whenever a new customer opened the door. Hearing the wind chime tubes sound off and a husky drawl order a cherry milkshake, and still he didn't look up from his notebook, too busy doodling Ida's newest upgrade to his hero suit, courtesy of Hatsumime. That was, of course, until someone pulled a chair up to his table and collapsed down onto it with a huff. You UA students sure like this place a bunch, huh? Yes, Izuku looked up by then. By then it was also, of course, too late. Shigaraki, he exhaled. The man raised one finger up, shaking it precariously. Nuh-uh, you remember what I told you last time about causing panic? No one wants that. Don't run, and I might not even need to get all close and personal, Midoriya. He set his milkshake down on the table, pink and fluffy and too light against the black of his hoodie. Izuku closed his notebook and shoved it into his bag. What do you want? He managed. Not even a question, just a quiet, trembling whisper. Shigaraki smiled wider. His eyes were barely visible, hidden by the hood and the hair locks. Oh, I don't want much. Just to catch up, you know? It's been so long since we had a friendly chat. They never had a friendly chat. We never had a friendly chat, Izuku said out loud, his eyes dashing around the room, frantically in search of possible escape routes, which wouldn't leave civilians in danger. You held me at gunpoint. Metaphorically, of course, for fingertips could hardly count as a gun. no less scary for it. Detail, detail, Shigaraki waved him off, slurping his milkshake. They really know how to make these here, huh? A nice place would be a shame if some little hero just bolted out of it, leaving the owner in a scary villain's hands. Izuku fixed him with a stare. His face was hot of anger or of fear, he couldn't tell. And he found his fist clenching tightly around his plastic straw. Leave her out of this, he said quietly. You want me here? I'm here. Ask. Ask. Shigaraki snorted, pitching his voice a few semitones up in an attempt at mockery. Well, at least you're being polite this time. Should have known earlier that the best way to get little heroes to cooperate is to threaten civilians around them. You did that last time too, if you don't recall. Izuku snapped hoarsely. What are you playing here, Shigaraki? What do you need? Glad you asked, the villain snorted. Currently trying to pass Watch Dogs 2. A fun little title. Actually, I'd recommend if you're into action games. Midoriya blinked. He couldn't help it. He just blinked and then stared at the man for a long, long moment, because a video game suggestion was ridiculously low on the list of things he expected to hear. Shigaraki threw his head back and laughed, quiet but sharp, almost like a crow's cawing. What, not an action guy? Can't say I'm surprised. But you're into visual novels and all that shit, for the plot no less. This time Izuku's blush was almost certainly of an embarrassment. Listen, he said, trying to keep his voice level. I don't get it. What do you want from me? I already told you, the man shrugged. A catch-up. Not to say anything about my fellow league members, but God, do they ever get on your nerves. You ever try to stay in the same building as Toga for longer than 24 hours? It's hell on earth. Midoriya blinked again. He figured that asking Shigaraki about his intentions for what? Third, fourth, fifth time would be ridiculous. Yet he was still no closer to figuring out the answer. He stirs his milkshake with his straw, almost absently, eyes focused on the villain's hood. Well, if you wanted to play the talking game, at least Izuku could play along. Is that so? He hummed carefully. I'd imagine. Oh, you couldn't even. Shigaraki grinned, clearly delighted that his rules were accepted. Even though Izuku couldn't for the life of him figure out what rules to what. The gremlin even pissed his Kurogiri off, and I thought it was nigh impossible. Kurogiri is Warp Gate. The mountain waved him off dismissively. Really, keep up, Midoriya. I could probably name your entire class at this point. Your school should really think their traditions through. Transmitting Japan's greatest upcoming stars on live television every year is hardly the most logical course of action, no? Izuku found himself nodding in agreement. So much for keeping up tight. He's discussed it with his classmates before, probably around the time of the provisional licensing exam, and they all came to an unanimous conclusion that as far as secrecy goes, especially with quirks such as Shinso's, even if the boy wasn't in their class yet, UA was decisively crappy. Glad you agree, Shigaraki smirked. How are fellow aspiring heroes? Studying hard? Sleeping enough? You don't look like you have the right to talk about anyone's sleeping habits. Izuku snapped, and then bit his tongue, because shit, this wasn't a friend on whom he could practice his combat skills. It was a villain who could kill him with a swoop of his hands. Fortunately, the villain seemed to have found it amusing. He took a long swig of his milkshake, half closing his eyes behind the tangled bangs, and then moved the glass aside. I wish you were wrong, he said, too solemnly to be serious. Can't remember the last time I got an 8 hours sleep. Criminal life waits for no man. And yet you choose it, Midoriya muttered. finishing his own drink in one long slip. Somehow, out of all things, that was the wrong one to say, because Shigaraki's eyes went dark as he looked away through the shop window. "Or did you choose me?" he asked, a weak attempt at mocking the tone he wore up to this point. "These things are a matter of gotcha spin, Midoriya. Some of us win, some of us lose." He clenched his fingers slowly, then unclenched them. And suddenly Izuku realized how, with uncomfortable vividness, that he knew just what that man meant. If even people like Shinso were whispered about behind their back when it came to quirks, then what would come of a kid who destroys everything he touches? Izuku wondered what's worse, that or lacking of a quirk entirely. "I suppose so," he said, too late and too quiet. "But then, people still win at poker with shitty hands. When they're very lucky and very good at bluffing." Shigaraki shrugged. "I'm neither. You would know." Izuku would know, if nothing else, that much they shared. Although, well, perhaps not the former. He could, although, after all, feel one for all crackling under his skin. "I wouldn't actually," he said instead. "Never played poker." That got him a laugh, and perhaps it was ridiculous to even feel passingly proud for getting a laugh out of a man who just threatened to kill an innocent civilian. But Midoriya did nonetheless. Shigaraki shook his head and looked at his milkshake in consideration before grabbing the glass with 4 fingers and finishing it with a swallow. He rummaged through the pockets of his hoodie, then threw some crumbled bills on the table between them. "Well, count your drink on me then," he smirked. "Nice chat. We should do that again sometime." And then he turned around and walked out, just like that, with the melody of wind chimes and the air of unease following him all the way out. Izuku looked through the shop window, eyes transfixed on the hooded figure as it made its way down the escalator and through the crowds, masterfully uninteresting. If you didn't know what to look for, you would never know you just brushed your shoulders with a villain. Izuku knew, though. Izuku knew. They most certainly shouldn't have done it again. And besides, the second time couldn't even be attributed to misfortune, because if you were frequenting a place where a villain would know to find you if he felt like it, was most certainly due to stubbornness, or naivety, or stupidity, same old song. Or maybe you could just really like their milkshakes. I mean, come on, student discounts were definitely worth an occasional brush with death. Or so Izuku tried to tell himself, at least as he pointedly didn't look up at the man who sat himself across from him. "What do they teach you future heroes?" Shigaraki marveled, setting a cherry milkshake atop their shared table. "You know, when I told Kurogiri about our last rendezvous, he was thoroughly disappointed in my general lack of caution." "I thought only Toga could do that." Izuku raised one eyebrow. The man snorted, taking a sip of his drink. "Nah. She's the only one who can piss him off. But disappointment is basically his constant state of being. Around you, I wonder why I'm not surprised." They sat in silence for a moment, engaged in a game of stare down in whether neither participants quite knew what was on the line. "You've got a sharp tongue, Midoriya. Didn't expect it from you. If I had 100 yen for every time someone told me that, I wouldn't need student discounts." "Well, in that case, I'm glad you don't. Or God forbid you'd stop showing your little freckled face around here. And what would I do with my Saturday afternoons then? Don't make this out to be a regular thing, Shigaraki. I hadn't agreed to it. I don't recall you agreeing to sit with me either, yet here we are. The man shrugged sarcastically. Wanted to ask you since last time for the record, you drink your milkshakes purely for aesthetic? Or do you actually think matcha and ice cream are a good combination? I would ask you the same, but pink doesn't even fit your look, Midoriya argued, rightfully offended. Cherry is the worst flavor you could have picked, and that's rivaling bubblegum. Excuse you, Shigaraki narrowed his eyes. Cherry is superior to everything else they sell here, and you with your matcha-colored hair don't even get to make an argument. I'm sure there's a logical fallacy there somewhere, Izuku muttered. Besides, you literally do not have a single right to talk about hair. Have you looked in the mirror lately? Do you even know what a hairbrush is? I don't reflect in mirrors, Shigaraki told him, so earnestly that Izuku was thrown off for a moment, hands itching for a pen to write it down. Was it quirk-related? A secondary one, perhaps? For it didn't seem to relate to decay in any significant manner. Then again, there were people whose appearances didn't really relate to their quirk at all. Take Ashido for instance. So perhaps it actually was just a... Shigaraki burst out laughing. You should have seen your face, Midoriya, he managed through wheezy snorts. You actually believed me. Oh my god. Izuku mumbled, feeling his cheeks and ears heat up again and taking a swig of his milkshake to cool them. Okay, in my defense, with your appearance, I really wouldn't be surprised. Petty, Shigaraki chuckled, his laughter finally settling. What else can I make you believe, I wonder? What if I tell you that Dabi glows in the dark, or that Spinner hibernates, that I am Nana Shimura's grandson? Okay, to be fair, Asui-san, Izuku began, and snapped his mouth shut, his straw slipping out of his fingers. Jokes and jeers can be very elaborate, sure, but they don't get so specific. Are you? Am I what? Shigaraki raised one eyebrow. Izuku exhaled in frustration, picking up his straw again and scraping it against the side of his glass. The last thing you said, he frowned. Shimura-san's, you know. What of it? The villain smirked, and the smirk was dark now. It reminded Izuku of their first encounter back in this mall, and of thin, cold fingers around his neck. What if I were Midoriya? Shouldn't even leave behind a legacy, or an inheritance, or even a wise word. Even if I were, what of it? He banged his fist against the table, and some customers turned their heads to face them. Izuku tried his best to make himself seem inconspicuous, to make it look like he wasn't trembling. Oh, but she did, Midoriya didn't say. He didn't say, although he really wanted to, that her legacy was all might and one for all, and in a strange, convoluted manner, even Midoriya and himself. All of that would be a secret too big of a secret to tell. That much he knew. But it didn't mean his tongue didn't itch with unspilled words. I don't know, he shrugged instead. His voice was flat, too flat to be realistic. But it was either that or pathetic quivers. I don't know what of it, Shigaraki. Just a really sad joke on the universe's behalf. When the man stormed out of the shop, Midoriya didn't even bother watching him leave. Why do it if you expect him to come back regardless? Still, perhaps he could have done the courtesy of paying for himself. A funny thing about classmates and other friends your age is small talk. It's so easy talking about the weather, or complaining about training sessions, or nerding about the latest hero debuts. You asked them whether they slept well, and what they got on their last English test, and if they're planning to go home to their parents for the weekend. You don't quite have the luxury of that when it came to milkshake dates with your arch nemesis. A ridiculous sentence in of itself, but the way, certainly not the one Izuku has ever thought he would need to use in regards to himself, if he ever thought it at all. It's not like he could just ask Shigaraki about homework exercises for God's sake. Shigaraki, for one, had no qualms about interrogating Midoriya on UA with all its daily routines and hero prodigies. But Izuku wasn't stupid enough to answer. Ditto the other way around, no matter how much he tried to elicit from the other men the details about the league's plans or new recruits. Shigaraki kept his mouth firmly shut. So that, in turn, pretty much left them without daily lives as far as topic conversations went. And talking about weather was just stupid. Oh, and hero news were, of course, far too tied up with the former. It's the civilians who had the privilege of discussing recent villain attacks as an unrelated topic. Shigaraki, on the other hand, was probably behind at least a couple of them. One thing they did have were milkshake flavors. Izuku would testify, for the record, even in the court of law, that cherry milkshakes did not have the right to exist. Shigaraki tried to argue that he would do the same against matcha-flavored ones, but joke's on him, because he wouldn't even dare show his face around a public institution. One day, I'm going to force you to try it, he said anonymously, and then you're going to have to admit that I'm right. Not before you try mine, Izuku argued, leaning back against the glass of the window. They were both, he had come to realize, exceptionally stubborn, but if anything, somehow, it made their chats that much more exciting. Then again, perhaps all the excitement was the adrenaline of being at table's length away from death. You want to see who's better at being convincing? Tomura raised his eyebrows, running his fingers down his glass, careful to keep at least one of them away from the cool surface. Case in point. I'd rather not, Midoriya laughed, taking a sip. Agree to disagree? He was, for the record, aware just how bad of an idea this entire thing was. But then, Izuku Midoriya was also known for bad ideas when it came to others. He threw himself at villains with nothing but a school bag, broke his bones in a seemingly futile bid to convince someone to battle with their all, and apparently hung out with crime overloads in milkshake bars. Okay, that was kind of unfair. Shigaraki wasn't really a crime overlord. He was just, well, that was one of the reasons why Izuku found himself going back, wasn't it? Shigaraki was just nothing. He was intriguing and mysterious, and far too dangerous to make for a good coffee date. But then, these weren't dates, and they didn't drink coffee, so Izuku was perhaps fine. And perhaps feeling bad for a villain who seemingly didn't see much wrong in almost murdering high school students was the stupidest, stubbornness, and most naive Izuku thing has done to date. But then, hell, what did he care? Agree to disagree, Shigaraki narrowed his eyes lazily. But keep your inferior opinions about berries to yourself, Midoriya. Aren't cherries technically a fruit? Okay, whichever scientist came up with these ridiculous qualifications, yeah, he didn't care at all. Except when... Get out of here, Aizawa-sensei barked at them. He stepped to the front of the class, eyes red, hair locks tossed upward by his quirk as much as the wind. But even he must have known that a fight like this he couldn't handle alone, not in an alleyway, in broad daylight, with panicked civilians and enemies surrounding his students from all sides. Except when Izuku was reminded just what made a villain such. And that one, almost 2A, was not allowed on field trips. Not now, not ever. They had their licenses, all of them by now. They could fight. No offense, Teach, but I don't think that's happening, Carmenere smirked, his hands crackling with static electricity. I think they need a reminder as to who the boss is here. I think you need a reminder, Jiro muttered. For all I remember, the last time you had to fight, you ended up frying your brains again, and Moma and I had to... Enough! A dry, loud, brisk command in a voice Izuku would give a lot not to find familiar for so many reasons. You want to remind us of something? Let's go. But then, in a fight, you don't really get to think about your regrets, or wishes, or tentative friendships based on a frankly ridiculous lack of small talk. In a fight, you get to think about running and jumping and not getting killed. And somehow, you have enough brain space to focus on minimizing injuries that could almost be seen as impressive. In a fight, Izuku Midoriya could almost forget who he was fighting against. For a bit. For as long as he could slam some small fry villains into wall and not come face to face with, well, face to hand? He thought that he should really ask Shigaraki what his deal with the hands was. And then that perhaps he shouldn't be planning not quite coffee date conversations while on the brink of death. Let him go, Aizawa-sensei said hoarsely. Shigaraki raised his eyebrow, not visible behind the hand, of course, but still evident in the slight amused upturn of his voice. Oh yeah, he said mockingly. I can hold on to him for way longer than you can keep from blinking, Eraserhead. Did Izuku mention yet that fingers around his neck was a complete and utter deja vu? And here he was thinking they were past this step in their relationship. I will kill you, Aizawa ground. You hurt my kid, I will kill you. How heroic. Perhaps if he had a bit more time to think instead of panicking, Izuku would be flattered. Or perhaps he would have thought of a better thing to say given the situation. Given everyone who could hear them right now. Maybe, hopefully, both. But, alas. What? He said instead of thinking. Too loud, too brittle. And he didn't quite watch, but still saw the villains and the heroes alike freeze in place around him. Good. Who knew what value did a startled Tomura Shigaraki give to their maybe friendship? You gonna kill me? Before I try a cherry milkshake? On second thought, maybe he wouldn't have thought of a better thing to say, even if he had the chance. Because the outright confusion, which reflected on Aizawa-sensei's face, was completely worth it. It even got better when Shigaraki laughed, like a raven, and dropped his hand to the side, not before running one finger down the side of Midoriya's face. You always know what to say, don't you, Izuku? He complained. A matcha milkshake? The shop owner smiled at him, her hair up in a braid and her apron tied with a neat little bow at the front. I was actually thinking cherry this time. Izuku grinned back, leaning against the counter. Oh, I've already started making matcha. She rubbed the back of her neck awkwardly, gesturing to the milkshake machine. So used to you having it. But it's no big deal. It's fine, a voice said behind him, a husky drawl. I'll have the matcha one. And Izuku, over here, will just have to owe me a favor for the other day. Izuku didn't need to turn around to see who was speaking. He did, however, need to stop himself from smiling. Couldn't let Shigaraki know just how irrationally happy he was to see him after having spent the week worrying he wouldn't not again. Not after messy battles and even messier reminders that they were still on the different sides of this particular barricade of morality and social norms. Not after his classmates and teachers drilled him on how exactly did mentoring a fruit-flavored cold beverage manage to ward off a villain fully intent on killing him. As if. It seemed, in any case, he also needed to stop worrying for nothing. Matcha for Tomura, then, he chirped, turning around anyways to meet the familiar red eyes under a mop of tangled, not quite bubblegum blue hair. Let's see what Cherry is all about, huh?